In 1985, I went to Europe on a school trip. We visited London, England, and Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Took a lot of photos when I was there. So here's a picture of the royal family in their wax sculptures. A lot of celebrities at the time. So I took a picture of Mr. P in wax form. I even appeared in one of the pictures. Here I am posing with, I don't know, Lord Nelson or something like that. But the thing that impacted me most was a display at Madame Tussauds, which actually had its origins back in 1802. And that was what was known at the time as the Chamber of Horrors. It no longer exists. But when we visited it in 1985, it left a big impact. It includes depictions of many historic killings, executions, as well as tortures. And in this picture I took, it is one man inflicting the garrote on another man. So that's where his windpipe is slowly crushed and he is strangled to death. Pretty memorable for like a 12, 13-year-old kid. Here's the thing that is significant about this. What the Chamber of Horrors illustrates is the degree to which the idea of torture as a just penalty was widely accepted within the quote unquote Christian West for centuries. It was just commonly assumed that it was appropriate for civic authorities to torture people as a form of punishment, including horrific killings like the Pear of Anguish or the garrote. One of the reasons that this was commonly assumed within Western society is because torture was also a part of the understanding of Christian theology. It was understood to be an eternal penalty that God would bring about against the wicked. Let's define torture. So, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, torture is the infliction of severe bodily pain, especially as a punishment or a means of persuasion. Now, that's true, but it's not all that torture is. Torture also can be mental, the infliction of mental pain or anguish, also as a form of punishment. So, for example, the man that tortures another man with the garrote is inflicting torture upon that man. The man that continually threatens to torture another man with a garrote is inflicting psychological or mental torture upon him. And that is also, yes, a kind of torture. So why was this assumed within Christian theology, or how was it assumed? Well, it was assumed again within the understanding of God's eschatological posthumous judgment of sinful human beings. Start, for example, with a passage like the parable of the ungrateful servant or the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18. The familiar story, as Jesus relays it, is that one king forgave an enormous debt from a man, and then that man went off and demanded the repayment of a trivial debt from somebody else. And this is then how the master or the king responds to his lack of mercy to his brother. The master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. So, one way to read this ending of this parable is to say that just as the master will hand the servant over to be tortured, so God will hand us over to be tortured posthumously. So that hell is God's infliction of severe mental and physical anguish, torment, punishment forever, and that is torture. And this is indeed how theologians in the mainstream eternal conscious torment tradition of Christianity talked about this understanding of punishment for centuries. So, for example, a theologian named Wendelin in 17th century, a scholastic Protestant, he says that God will, quote, preserve bodies numerically. In other words, the same person that dies will be resurrected to judgment. And then he goes on, And he said God will, quote, rack them with eternal torture. So he will rack bodies with torture. Samuel Hopkins, another period theologian, says, in whatever way or degree the wicked will suffer pain by the body, it is not to be doubted that their mental pain and suffering will be the chief part of their punishment. Indeed, such a situation and torture of their bodies, as has now been mentioned, is suited to fill their minds with an amazing sense of the awful power and dreadful anger of God. And he goes on from there. The point being, God will resurrect people to torture them in body and mind for eternity. And if you believe that that is, in fact, how God will treat the wicked, the unregenerate in eternity, then that provides an obvious rational justification for infliction of finite tortures now. Something changed in the last couple centuries, and today people widely consider torture to be morally indefensible or unconscionable. There was a debate 20 years ago, for example, in the United States over the Bush government's use of waterboarding as a way to attempt to get information in the wake of 9/11. What was interesting is that there were very few, if any, people defending torture of prisoners. Rather, what people were debating is whether or not waterboarding would qualify as torture. And this really, to my mind, culminated in an article, I believe it was in Vanity Fair, written by Chris Hitchens, in which he experienced waterboarding for himself and wrote the article and said, trust me, it's torture. The assumption, again, of the whole conversation being that if waterboarding is torture, it's wrong. Because we all recognize today that torture is wrong. And it's interesting that even the Christian theologians who continue to defend um, eternal conscious torment as the model by which God will posthumously punish the wicked or the unregenerate, even they are loath to say that God is torturing anybody. At most, they will adopt C.S. Lewis's line to say that people are actually inflicting suffering upon themselves and God simply turns them over to their own desires. So, one of C.S. Lewis's famous um, claims the gates of hell are locked on the inside. People choose to be there. They, in a sense, want to be there. God is simply allowing them to experience the results of their own choices. Or C.S. Lewis also in one of his books says that, and I forget the wording, but essentially hell is human beings no to God. So essentially the human being, or no, I should say, hell is God saying, thy will be done to that effect. So again, the same thing is that people are inflicting torture upon themselves. And it's interesting again that so nobody is thinking that torture is a morally justifiable or good thing. Everybody tries to reconcile the doctrine of eternal conscious torment with the assumption that in fact torture is morally unconscionable. Now, I think that that is a failed exercise. That the advocate of eternal conscious torment is still saying that God has purposed the suffering that people inflict upon themselves as a form of punishment. That's why on that interpretation, let's say of Matthew 25, 41, and 46, Jesus is referring to eternal punishment. So the punishment never ends, it's eternal. Now, the punishment may be self inflicted, but it's still punishment. In other words, God is appropriating the torture that people inflict upon themselves as his form of punishment. So removing him one step from the process doesn't change the fact that he is still torturing people, but he's using the agents themselves to torture themselves as his means of torturing them as punishment. That's no improvement. I think that advocates of eternal conscious torment need to take the next step and recognize that that whole framework is morally unconscionable. And I think it's bad hermeneutics, it's bad exegesis, it's bad theology, and they need to have a paradigm shift in how they understand posthumous judgment altogether. Now, the big thing, however, is to appreciate that a paradigm shift has already occurred with respect to torture. It's simply a matter of the next paradigm shift, rejecting eternal conscious torment altogether. Now, this brings me lastly to my continued work on biblical violence, which again, I believe fits into this paradigm. When I ended the book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, I ended it by advocating for the fact that we need to get to the point where people do not even consider these pro genocide, pro ethnic cleansing, tortured readings torture, using advisedly as a pun here, perhaps, but these tortured readings of Deuteronomy 20 or Joshua 6 or 1 Samuel 15, passages that describe God commanding and commending the killing of children and infants and women and other civilians. And Christian apologists that continue to defend these readings, people like Paul Copan and William Lane Craig, and the whole raft of apologists who defend these kinds of readings. We need to get to a point where there's a paradigm shift in Christianity, and those readings are as unthinkable uh, and as verboten and rejected, and just outside the entire plausibility framework of the thinking Christian as current views of torture are, that people today just don't think God tortures people. We need to get to the point where they likewise would not even consider the credibility of a claim that God would have commanded genocidal, ethnic cleansing, killing of human beings, civilian human beings, children, women, infants, and so on. This brings me to a recent interview I did with Miles Donahue. He's a philosopher. He invited me on to talk about my work on biblical violence. I've linked that below if you're interested in continuing to think about bringing about that paradigm shift in Christianity so that we can get to the point where, in the same way that torture is no longer thinkable within a Christian understanding of reality, so eternal conscious torment itself is no longer thinkable. And so genocide and ethnic cleansing and these pro-violent readings and civilian killing readings of the Bible are no longer thinkable within a Christian worldview.